This is the first in a series of videos where we're going to talk about the ALERRT Room Entry System. This particular video focuses on a general introduction to the system and discusses why we moved away from a traditional SWAT style entry. Before we get into the details of that, I always like to begin with a real-world situation. So this is a video from an attack that happened in Aurora, Illinois not too long ago.
At approximately 1:24 today, the Aurora Police Department received multiple calls for an active shooter at 641 Archer Avenue, a manufacturing warehouse. At 1:28, officers arrived and were fired upon immediately. Two of the initial four officers entering the building were shot. Additional officers began to arrive and were also fired upon. A total of 5 officers were struck by gunfire. The other officers on the scene located gunshot victims inside the building. At this time, we have confirmed that 5 victims are deceased. The building is 29,000 square feet, and when they located the offender, they engaged in gunfire with him, ultimately killing him. The shooter, he is a 45-year-old man, and we believe he was an employee of the company. At this time, we aren't sure of the motive of this act of violence.
In total, 5 responding officers were shot during this event. And that reinforces how important it is to train and prepare officers to deal with the situations they're going to encounter in these events. And one of the common things that we train people in is room entries. So that's what we're going to talk about in the rest of this series. When ALERRT began teaching room entries, we started with what we would call a traditional SWAT style entry. And that might look something like this. This is the same entry in a little bit slower format so you can see a little bit better what's going on. First officer is going to go to what we refer to as the hard or the unknown corner. The second one's going to go opposite of that, and the other 2 fill the middle. Over time, we moved away from teaching that style of entry, and there are 3 primary reasons that we changed. The first one is that in doing research, we realized that active attacks are not the same as SWAT situations. This chart is designed to show the differences between SWAT calls and active attacks. The 2 most common SWAT calls are warrant services and hostage barricades, and then we'll compare those to what happens during active attacks. You can think of warrant services as being situations that allow a high level of planning and preparation and also contain a high amount of information. And that's because warrants are usually pre-planned. They know where they're going to go to serve the warrant, they know who they're looking for with the warrant. They may have the location under surveillance. They may have other information from informants. So there's a lot of information available in warrant calls compared to these other 2 types of calls. And when you encounter other people during a warrant service, you generally assume they're hostile until they're proven otherwise. Hostage barricades don't offer as much opportunity for planning and preparation because they tend to happen spontaneously. They're not pre-planned. However, they do allow at least a moderate level of planning and preparation in that the SWAT team at least has a general plan in place about how they deal with these types of calls. And as they show up on scene and slow things down, they're oftentimes able to engage in negotiations to further slow things down and give them time to get more information, do better planning and preparation appropriate to the location and the situation. And lastly, in that situation, people that are encountered in this site are probably not hostile, but they could be. And both those situations are very different from active attacks. An officer learns about an active attack situation via radio call usually. They just get dispatched to an active shooter or an event happening in a particular location. So the only planning time they have is from the time they get the call until the time they get to the location. Oftentimes they get very little information over the radio about what's going on, and some of that information may even be incorrect. When they arrive at the scene, there may be a lot of people there. Most of them are probably not hostile, but you don't know for sure who the attacker is, and they could be hostile. So you have a situation where during an active attack, it's very different than what happens on a typical SWAT call. The next issue is that active attack responders are not SWAT teams. They're very different. This chart's designed to illustrate the differences between a SWAT team and an active attack group. So when you talk about a SWAT team, they truly are an integrated team. They get to select who's on the team, they train together, they work call-outs together. They tend to have a much higher level of tactical experience and skill than other officers in a police department, and they tend to operate in a set group. Here we say always 4+, but different SWAT teams are structured differently. But they're going to show up with that group and always work with that group. An active attack is almost a completely different situation. It's an ad hoc group. You don't know who's going to show up. They're going to randomly arrive based upon where they were at when the call went out and how quickly they can get to the location. As far as tactical skill and experience, they tend to be much lower than SWAT team members, and usually they're going to be operating in a group less than 4. And the reason for that is that while many departments originally structured their active attack response to be based on what SWAT teams did, they realized it can take too long to get 4 people there to go into a structure. And so they started authorizing smaller and smaller groups to enter attack sites. And now it's not uncommon across the country to see departments authorizing solo officer entry into these events. And so usually now you're going to see less than 4 officers making that initial entry. So an active attack group is very different from a SWAT team. And the last issue that we encountered is it's very hard for people with limited training to do complicated advanced SWAT type stuff. And we found that we tried to teach them to do that in our limited training environments that we had, they tended to not do very well. So just to summarize why we felt the need to change away from that more traditional SWAT style of entry. First, it's a different situation. Active shooter events or active attacks are not SWAT calls. Second, we're dealing with different people. It's not a SWAT team that's responding, it's an ad hoc group of responders. Third, that group of people has a different level of training than a SWAT team. So if you have a different situation responded to with different people who have a different level of training, that suggests you may need to have a different system for handling room entries. And that's why we began to move away from that more traditional SWAT style of entry. So the question is obviously, what is that system? In this next little bit, I'm going to give you just a teaser of what the system is. We'll take a much deeper dive into it later on in this series. I know that this will raise a lot of questions and you'll have a lot of what ifs that you're concerned about. We will start to address those as we go through the whole series of videos here. So let's start with our basic setup. We have 2 officers responding, not 4. They are responding to an exigent situation, meaning that there is gunfire ringing out. They need to get there and stop the killing as quickly as possible. We begin with a threshold evaluation. So the officers move quickly down the hall. They pie off the doorway to see as much as they can of the room, and they will deal with any problems they can see from the doorway. So in this case, the bad guy is standing in the corner, so they can't see him from the doorway, but if he was in the middle of the room, they would have engaged him from out in the hallway. Next, they're going to pause for a second, plan their room entry, and then they're going to execute their room entry. When they do, both officers are going to direct their firepower first to the hard corner before they look anywhere else in the room. And the reason for that is they've seen everywhere else in the room. They haven't seen that hard corner yet. So this is what that would look like. Now they'll stop, they'll assess what's happened with the bad guy, they'll take a second and make a plan for how they're going to deal with the rest of the room. Now let's change the situation. In this one, the bad guy is behind a desk. In this case, we're going to say he's using the desk for cover. It's not good cover, but he's using it for cover. He's partially concealed, but he is visible from the threshold when they do the entry. So in this case, they come down, they do the threshold evaluation, they engage him from the threshold, they pause, they make a plan for their room entry. They're still going to direct their attention first into that unknown corner that they haven't seen yet from the threshold evaluation, because that's the one area they haven't seen, and then they'll address the guy that's down behind the desk. Like so. In the third scenario, the bad guy's hiding behind the desk. In this case, he's completely concealed. They cannot see him during the threshold evaluation. So they come down, they do the threshold evaluation, they make a plan for their room entry, and we're going to say as they make their room entry, the bad guy is going to come up to try to engage them. They will still look in that unknown corner first, and then they'll address the guy on the desk. So in a nutshell, that's the basics of the room entry system. We'll go through all the details in the follow-on videos, and I hope this has been worth your while. Thanks.